recording now. All right, and I'll introduce our speaker today, who is Monica Gerber, a full professor at the Universidad Diego Portales in Chile. And I know her also through the International Society of Political Psychology, which is meeting next week in your country. So that's nice. And Monica will be presenting today on the role of police repression in support for violent collective action, and also the role of justice perceptions, which I know has been one of your areas of research in the past as well. So we will have a brief presentation of her work in progress, about 20 minutes or so, and afterwards have a lot of time for discussion and questions. If you would like to, one moment. If you would like to share some collective notes in our Jamboard, I put the link in the chat. It's basically a slide where you can use sticky notes to write down your questions or thoughts, just things you want to capture so that we have a collective record of various ideas that came up during the session, and we can use it later also for discussion. All right, so without further delay, Monica, please get started. You're not speaking yet, right? No, you're not muted. Okay.
Can you see my slides?
We could. Now I can see your files.
Oh,
But
okay,
before your slides were there.
Let me just. Sorry. I'm delaying everything today. Let me
just before this, there was a slide with your talk.
Yeah, I think it's here. Okay, can you see them now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Joanna, for the invitation. And today I'm going to talk about this ongoing project. This is something that we've been working on for some time now, but there's always some issues that we don't know how to solve. So all comments and questions are more than welcome. This is research with Joaquín Bahamondes from Universidad Católica del Norte in Chile. And it's called Police Use of Force Promotes Protester Violence, the Mediating Role of Social Identity and Perceived Procedural Justice in the Context of Police-Protester Relationships. So to start, I would like to highlight the importance of law enforcement in society. So, because this is about the relationship between the police and citizens, and the question is, why is this important? And in the words of Trinkner and Atiba Goff, the law as a whole is an essential piece of the fabric of society in that it serves to organize our social environment by facilitating human interaction, by establishing formal codes of conduct and resolving conflicts when they arise. And the interesting part here is that the police is basically, you don't really see when you don't interact with judges or with a tribunal, but you do interact with the police. So the police ends up being the face of the law. And this is why it's so important to look into the relationship between citizens and the police. And if you think about modern society, it's not really possible for the police to achieve their goal of maintaining social order through force only. It wouldn't be possible to be everywhere and to be controlling everyone. So what we found is that the police requires public support. It requires for the public to have internalized a sense that it's the right thing to obey, it's the right thing to follow the law, it's the right thing not to steal or not to break the law in different ways. And it's also important because when there's trust in the police, people are more willing to work in ways that are beneficial for society, to solve community problems, to report crimes when there are crimes, so on and so forth. And at the same time, when there's trust in the police, then there's little need for using violence to achieve social order. So that's basically the starting point of this presentation. However, there are a number of places and situations where there have been very violent encounters between the police and protesters. So, for example, in Paris 2000, 10, and then in Chile, where this research is based, we had hundreds of people losing their eyes due to police brutality in the social uprising in 2019. And then think about Chicago with the death of George Floyd, Iran, and then France again in 2022. So these are just few examples of situations where there are violent exchanges between protesters who use violence as a way of promoting social change, but also police who repress such demonstrations, or they also repress often non-violent demonstrations. So that's even a stronger problem. So the question that arises is, why do people think that it's okay to use violence as a means of protest? And while this sounds a little bit obvious, but the focus of this talk is on the role of police repression. So that's what sounds obvious, is that the more police repression, the more likely it is that you will use violence as a way of promoting social change as a response to this repression. However, the question is basically, what are the mechanisms through which this process occurs? And so to start with some definitions, we understand collective action as any action that promotes the interests of one's group or is conducted in political solidarity. And you can distinguish two different types of collective action, normative and non-normative. Basically, whether collective action is in line with social norms in a specific place, or whether it's more outside of this accepted forms of demonstration, whether it's transgressive or radical. And today we will focus on violent collective action, which is something that, well, we will look into basically what people define as violent as a way of defining it. And we call this violence for social change or counter dominance, where violence is used as a way of protesting. So I forgot to say, but the two mechanisms through which we're trying to understand the role of police repression on support for collective violence is basically through procedural justice, which is related to this social justice theory, and through social identity, which is related to another model that I'll speak in a minute. So to start with, people care about justice. So we are worried about unjust situations, and we react to unjust situations. And the literature has distinguished between two types of justice: distributive and procedural. Distributive has to do with the ways in which you evaluate whether it's fair, how outcomes are distributed. So, for example, how income is distributed among different people. But then research has shown that above and beyond the relevance of distributive justice, people also care about the procedures through which these allocations are made. So it's also about how authorities develop or carry out their jobs and to achieve such distributive justice. So what is procedural justice? Procedural justice has to do with four main issues. So first, whether authorities grant people with voice and participation, whether people can participate and express their voice is something really relevant, because that's a way of feeling respected and well treated by authorities. Then there's neutrality, the idea that authorities treat everyone the same. They don't give some people a better treatment or a worse treatment because they belong to certain minorities. Then there's trustworthiness, the idea that the police or authorities in general have people's well-being in mind. And then there's dignity and respect, the idea that people are treated with dignity and respect, how the word already explained. So why is it relevant? So at the beginning, research assumed that procedural justice was relevant because when there's justice in the procedures, then it means that the outcome will be just. However, there is more and more evidence showing that procedures matter by themselves, and they matter because they have identity relevant information. So when you feel that your group is being respected, your group is being treated procedurally in a procedurally fair way, you feel that you're accepted in society, and this makes you want to identify stronger with a specific group. Because coming from social identity theory, we understand that you have an identity that gives you positive self-esteem. So when you feel that your group is being treated fairly, this makes you more wanting to relate to this group that has positive self-esteem for you. And one thing that we found on the opposite side of it is that when there's procedural injustice, when there's procedural justice, people want to participate in a group, they want to support a group, they want to act for the benefits of this group. But when there's procedural injustice, the other way around, things happen like support for violent demonstrations. So I think I'm running a little bit late, so I'm just going to be very, very quick about this. But we've conducted some previous research showing that procedural justice is one relevant antecedent of support for violence carried out by the police and support for violence carried out by indigenous activists. So basically, when you perceive that there is fairness in the procedures, you are more likely to support violence carried out by the police, and you're less likely to support violence carried out by indigenous activists as a way of protesting. So we know that, at least this is an experiment, and we know that in an experiment there is an effect of procedural injustice on support for violence. And then there's this other study where we find the same, but this time looking at general protests and general violence in demonstrations in Chile as well. And again, when there's procedural injustice, people tend to legitimize the police less, they support the police less, and therefore they also are more likely to use or to support the use of violence as a way of protesting. So the first mechanism that we're using to explain why police repression promotes protester violence is through procedural justice. So police repression would increase your perception of procedural injustice, and procedural injustice in turn would lead you to support or be more likely to engage in violent demonstrations. And then there's a second mechanism that we're using to explain this relationship, which is the elaborated social identity model, which is research conducted in the context of crowds in the UK. And what the authors have argued is that when there's a demonstration, police officers tend to become violent towards all protesters, regardless of whether they were violent at the beginning. And because they just see protesters as a group, as a bunch of people who are similar, and if one uses violence, then all are likely to use violence. So they start by using violence against them, and this in turn makes people who can start with being moderate to use more and more violence as a way of identifying with radical protesters, and therefore supporting more violence as a result. And what research has found so far is that unjust use of force and illegitimate action by the police increases support for violent demonstrations. So the model that we're testing, and while there is some evidence for each of these arrows here, the model that we're testing, we will test with longitudinal data, which is a way of also looking into whether one variable at one point in time has an effect on the other on a second point in time. And the argument here is that experienced police violence will increase perceived procedural injustice. So people will perceive that authorities are being unfair in the procedures that they use to achieve social order in demonstrations. And this will increase justification of protester violence. And at the same time, when people perceive police violence, they are also more likely to identify with radical protesters. And this identification will also feed into a higher justification of protester violence. So the data, the context is Chile. As you know, in 2019, we had this social uprising, which started to become more and more violent, and where there was very strong police repression, with people losing their eyes due to police using these bullets to control demonstrations. And in this context, we run this survey like a year after, but we asked people about their experiences 12 months before. So we did capture many people who were actually victims of police repression, and we can test directly for this effect, not just whether they saw other people being victims, but whether they were victims themselves. So this is a 3-wave longitudinal survey with 6 months in between waves. We started with a sample of 2017-15 cases, 2,715 cases, and of course we ended up with less than half, but still a large number of respondents. This is not a representative sample, but we're more interested in looking at internal mechanisms more than generalizable results. And then the analysis is conducted through a random intercept cross-lag panel model. So what are the examples of items that we use? So participation in demonstrations. Have you attended a public demonstration? Direct experience of police violence. Have you personally experienced some sort of violence from police officers during a demonstration? I'm not going to use vicarious, but we also measured whether they had seen someone being treated violently during a demonstration. And then procedural justice, for example, how frequently do carabineros, which is the main police force in Chile, how frequently do the police treat people with dignity and respect? Identification with demonstrators, we asked, I feel a close link with demonstrators, but specifically to this group called La Primera Línea, which is like the more radical protesters in the social uprising. And the justification of violence towards the police, to the extent is it justified to throw stones at the police? And as I said before, one thing that is interesting is that in this data set, we have 43% of people in wave 1 who participated in a demonstration, which is really high, but it's consistent with other research. And 16% of people who participated in a demonstration experienced personal police violence. This is about 400 people in the sample. So it's actually quite interesting because, I mean, it's not good news that we have 400 people who experience violence, but it's good news for research, right? Because we can test this effect. And if we look at results, and this is, I'm only showing wave 1 to wave 2 because in this occasion, we are doing a stationary model where we're fixing the effects to be the same from wave 1 to wave 2 and from wave 2 to wave 3. This is something that we still need to figure out whether it's a good idea to do it like this or not. So any comments are welcome. So what you can see, the arrows are all significant effects. I'll focus on some of these. So for example, we see that participating in a protest and experiencing police violence in the protest increases perceived procedural injustice. And then as hypothesized, and then there's also an effect from protester identification. So people who identify more with radical protesters are also more likely to perceive procedural injustice. And people who already justify protester violence are also more likely to perceive procedural injustice. And then here is, we find something that is contrary to our hypothesis, basically that there's no effect of experiencing protester violence on protester identification. I must say that I ran these models several times, and at the beginning there was an effect, but something happened in the recoding. So we're still trying to figure out what happens and whether these results are the correct ones or not. But in general, at least for now, there's no effect on experiencing police violence on protester identification. So for now, all of the effect would be through perceived procedural injustice. But there is an effect of perceived procedural injustice on protester identification. So the more you perceive that there's injustice in the treatment of police officers in time 1, you're more likely to identify with radical protesters in time 2. And the same with justification of protester violence. So there is this effect that goes the other way around, where you justify protester violence and you're also more likely to identify with radical protesters. And finally, there is a direct effect of having experienced police violence on the justification of protester violence. So people who experience police violence are more likely to justify violence in demonstrations, which is interesting because it goes with the hypothesis of our model, although we hypothesized that the effect would be mediated by perceptions of procedural injustice and identification with radical protesters, but we still find a direct effect. And then there's this effect of perceived procedural injustice on justification of protester violence, and also an effect of protester identification on justification of protester violence. So if you look at these results all together, we do find that there is an indirect effect if you consider this effect from protest with police violence on perceived procedural injustice, and then from perceived procedural injustice on justification of protester violence. There is a significant mediation from having experienced police brutality on the justification of protester violence mediated by perceived procedural injustice. However, we did not find a mediation through identification with radical protesters. If we had 4 waves, we could have found this, because there is an effect of protester identification on perceived procedural injustice. So you could think that if we had 4 waves, there would be an effect from experiencing police repression on perceived procedural injustice, from perceived procedural injustice on identification with radical protesters, and from identification from radical protesters to justification of protester violence. So there are some hints that this could be the case, but we don't have that data. So to conclude, as research in many areas has shown, procedural justice matters. So people care about the procedures through which authorities carry out their work. Procedural justice has identity relevant information. It's symbolically very relevant for people to see that authorities are treating them respectfully, and this has an effect in this case on the justification of protester violence. And we do think that it's possible to link these 2 theories, procedural justice and the elaborated social identity model, although the effects are not so consistent with the elaborated social identity model. And we also need to figure out how to link these results to other models of collective action, such as the SIMCA model. And I also always like to conclude these topics talking about the irony of harmony. So you could think that it's a good thing that police treat protesters with dignity and respect, that there's just treatment, and this, of course, it's a good thing by itself. However, the problem is whether there is a fair treatment, but then outcomes are not allocated fairly. So this can be sort of like a marketing thing, where police officers treat people in a very respectful way, and they convince people to, for example, not support violence in demonstrations. But they can also be unfair in different ways and not really solve any problems in terms of how the different social groups are treated, so on and so forth. So it's and I say this because there are some interventions conducted with police officers to make their treatment be more fair. But then if there's no distributive justice, then one could argue that it's not the best thing to do. And what we're doing now, we started a 7-wave longitudinal survey. We haven't had much luck so far because the sample size is being really, really small, but I hope that we can draw some conclusions. And of course, there's always the need for confirmatory experimental research. That's it. So thank you. This is my email. If you have any comments or questions, I will be more than happy, because as I said, this is ongoing research and we need to decide on a few issues before we send for publication. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'm looking for that emoji that claps, but I can't. Okay. Do you want to unshare your slides so we can see each other better? Yes, and anyone who would like to show their face is welcome to do so. So I don't see any questions on the Jamboard, but if you want to note anything on the Jamboard at any point, you can do so. I'll send it around again through the link. Do we have any immediate questions for Monica? If not immediate, I'll just ask one to warm up the discussion. So actually, related to what you were talking about at the end, I was wondering throughout the presentation about the implications of this research and the ethics of what we do with the findings, and and how these findings could be used in different ways depending on who gets their hands on them, right, or who writes about them. So I mean, I think what you suggested at the end was basically both kind of a warning that one could use it to give the recommendation, let's say, to police, right? Like, don't use so much police brutality, that will only backlash. But as you said, even with that recommendation, there might be ways in which they could then use that to just kind of more effectively repress with a velvet glove or something like that. So I'm just curious to hear from you how you approached the research initially, like what was the motivation for starting this line of work, and what kinds of implications you see in it, practical implications, and also then any kind of ethical considerations you have in how you communicate these findings.
Yes,
Different
thank you,
audience.
Johanna, for your question. Yes, this is a tricky question. So we did start this right after the social uprising. We created this observatory of violence and legitimacy with Anna here. And Anna has also been helping out with this research. And we were interested, of course, in having public policy interventions or influence somehow. It's not so easy. We have been working a little bit with the police. So, for example, we went to present some of these findings to police officers, to generals from Chile, from all across the country. And there was some very good reception. However, some of them said that they would contact us, and at the end of the day, never really did. So you feel like they say they care, but they don't really care. Maybe because it's not so viable or so easy to use this as a procedure to teach police officers, because I think that's what should happen. I mean, this should be part of their training as when they start, or also during their career. So ethical considerations, yeah, we did ask people whether they applied force and whether they were victims. So of course it's a sensitive issue. We work with consent, individual consent, of course, and we also always give them the chance to stop the participation and to express whether they have any concerns. And then we did ask people whether they themselves used violence, which is something that we protected their identities, because this was done through a consultancy company, and they only have the people's identification. We don't. So the good thing is that if we have the sample size, but if someone said that they used violence, we can't really go back and see who said this, and that's important for protection in case the police would want to get involved or have access to the data. So we try to protect people in this way, but I mean, I think that the big question is what to do with this data, how to use it, and if you have any other ideas more than trying to contact the police to have, I mean, we are working hand in hand with them. We had a meeting the other day with the Ministry of Interior, for example, and everyone seems to be very interested, but at the end of the day, nothing really happens. And even if you had training, which is something that would be positive, because yeah, I talked about this irony of harmony thing, which I really believe, but at the same time, procedural justice is relevant by itself. So I think even if it's disguising somehow other forms of injustice or other forms of mistreatment, it would be a good thing to increase procedural justice in the treatment of police officers. So, for example, when we think about stop and frisk activities, for example, it would be relevant that police officers treat everyone neutrally and not some groups more than others, for example.
Thank you. Yeah, and to clarify, by ethical concerns, in this case, I actually simply meant the implications of, you know, communicating the findings and how the findings are used, not like the consent form and confidentiality of the data that I take as a given that you do that. So it's more about, you know, what could these findings do with different, you know, in different hands. But as you said, I mean, there's you know, if one can use it strategically to argue, look, here is, and this is something that has come up in several points throughout this series, right? Because there is research on the backlash effect of repression, which can be used, you know, strategically to communicate to state authorities. It's actually not in your interest to repress people because it will, you know, come home to roost you, or will have backlash, unintended backlash consequences.
Yeah.
So I think there's a similar kind of strategic message one can give there with those findings.
Yeah, I think it's also not something that they really want to use repression. I think it's also part of their lack of training or lack of experience with situations where there's violence in demonstrations or even demonstrations in general. So in some places too, for example, in the UK, I know that they have incorporated training to make the procedures during demonstrations to be less violent. And I think that's also something that could be worked on. As you say, I think they're communicating that police repression will have an effect again in increasing more violence is something that should, because often the assumption is the opposite, right? And we know from research that people don't usually care about the implications, so they don't think, okay, so if there's police repression, that means that I will use less violence because something can happen to me. And so that's something that police could think about. They could think that if they use violence, people will stop protesting because they're afraid of violence. But what we know is the opposite is true. So people get more angry and they want to protest more because people don't really care, or they don't really think that they will be victims of police repression. So they're not afraid of protesting in any case.
Yeah, and that relates to findings by Ayanian et al., right, on the effects of and Aya Adra on the effects of repression on fear and risk, and that it's actually moral outrage that is a much stronger predictor than any kind of concerns about one's own safety. And actually, the more violence that is used and the more risk you experience, the less afraid people become and the more angry. So yeah, I should stop talking. Who else has questions? Leah, go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't find the hand raising emoji, but I don't really have a good answer or suggestion or anything, but I think the same kind of question immediately came to my mind as well, because I mean, we found something similar. We've done some experiments on not police violence, but sort of the police showing up at protests in riot gear versus sort of being dressed in regular uniforms and sort of suggesting, I guess it's like implied violence rather than actual violence. And we had similar results where basically it showed that people would see the police stopping and dispersing their protest, which was completely, legal and everything, as more legitimate when they were not dressed in riot gear. So essentially, for me, that really raised the same implication, basically, because our results could send that kind of velvet glove message of saying, well, if you disperse people, not implying that you could use violence, then they'll suddenly see that as legitimate, even though it's just as illegitimate as it was in the other situation. So yeah, for me, the question also has been, and I guess I was also maybe hoping to hear some ideas on that in this discussion, sort of how can we maybe sort of flip that around? And I mean, is there a way of using interventions to kind of use this to, I don't know, make police violence or the threat of it more visible, and thus sort of use it to justify protesters instead. I mean, I guess these effects on identification are probably a good start for that, and something that I find really promising. But yeah, at the same time, yeah, I guess more of the same question really that has sort of come up with what I've seen in our data, just this question of where do we go from here, and how can this be used to an end that doesn't just sort of suggest how we can legitimize the status quo more, or like make repression more invisible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some interventions, and for example, other interventions are having, instead of male police officers, have women police officers. I think that that's also especially for women's demonstrations for the 8th of March or something. I think that that's also a way of, or as you said, like depending on the clothes they wear or the type of strategy they use, whether they start using violence right at the beginning of the demonstration or only when there's actual violence involved. I think there are some trainings that can be, I think maybe when it comes to procedural justice, you don't want them only to be trained in increasing procedural justice, but you do want them to be trained in not using police violence. So I think that if you can get in touch with different like strategies to reduce police violence, and I think that also has to do with some knowledge on how crowds work, so how to control crowds without actually having to resort to violence. I think that that's also very important, and that's also work that I know that some people have been conducting in the UK. And I think also when it comes to training, human rights training, I think, for example, the idea that protesting is a human right, I think it's also very important, because for police officers, often demonstrations are illegal by themselves, as you said. Like it's being legitimized when police officers stop protesters and not consider and they do not consider that actually it's the right to demonstrate. And I think that's something that you can also train police officers to understand. So I know that there are some trainings in human rights, but I think they're not enough. I mean, you can see that they're not enough when you see the repercussions of the violence in demonstrations.
Maybe two clarification questions on your, just to check if I understood it correctly from your methods, and then if you have any other data that speaks to the question, because I assume in your data you're asking about protests that were non-violent to start with, where the police started escalating the violence, as opposed to protests where, you know, in some protests you'll suddenly have like anarchists, individuals show up and provoke the police, right? Even if overall the protest is nonviolent. And I'm just wondering if, you know, the response and your hypothesized responses would play out differently if the violence, if the protest was disruptive or violent to begin with, or if there were individuals embedded within the protest that started the violence. That's one question. And the second question is, if I understood correctly, you're asking about kind of justification and support. Like, do you think this is okay to do, right? But not whether people themselves would participate in more violent tactics. So I'm wondering if any of your measures also had data on whether it increases. I mean, we can kind of assume when people justify it, they might also be more likely to participate in violent tactics, but I'm wondering if those findings would generalize to help explain switch of tactics within protests.
Yeah, we didn't have a measure of how violent the demonstrations were, just because we asked people whether they participated, but we didn't ask whether the demonstration where they participated was violent or not. We just ask in general whether it's justified to use violence as a means of protest. So it's not related to any specific demonstration. But we did ask in general whether they were had been victims of police repression during the last 12 months. That's what so it's for people who went to one demonstration or people who went to several. It's just whether they were exposed to violence. And then the second question, yes, we did ask people whether they used violence themselves, but the problem is that only few did, so it's difficult to model. I did some models and we did find similar results. I was wondering whether to put that in the paper, but as I said, it's only a few cases, so it's not very stable. The models are not very stable. So, and as you said, I mean, one would expect the effects to be very similar, but they're actually not always, because it's so easier to predict attitudes, but it's more difficult to predict behaviors, because behaviors are related to other external variables. So it's not so easy. And then you'd also have to concentrate only on those people who participated in demonstrations, not on everyone, which also makes it more complicated. So for now, we're focusing only on justification of protester violence.
That's maybe where qualitative mixed methods would come in handy, right? If you only have a few cases to interview people, what made them escalate within the protests?
Yes, well, the research that they have done in the UK with the elaborated social identity model is ethnographic research. It's really, really interesting. They take part in demonstrations and they look at how the violence starts to escalate, and they look at how people start being very peaceful, and then the police comes in and then they start increasing their violent messages. We are conducting some qualitative research as well with some focus groups, and now we started longitudinal focus groups. And longitudinal, we're also interviewing police officers to get in touch with their feelings about how violence is used, whether it's legitimate or not, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I was just asking also again, because of the implications of the research, right? So I guess if we want to like strategically use the findings to argue, look, police, it's going to backlash if you use these tactics, it would be perhaps more compelling if one can actually show an effect on behavior and change of tactics, as opposed to support, like public support for violent protesters, which is maybe less of a less threatening or less of a concern to them. But yeah, just wondering.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe we could look into that data too.
Yeah, future research. Leah.
Yeah, thanks. An actual question this time. I was just thinking, when you were talking about the escalation of violence, did you also look at how much people justified or legitimized the police using violence? I feel like with longitudinal data, that might be interesting to look sort of how these things might change relative to each other. So, because I mean, people probably have some sort of like lay theories about escalation of violence and stuff as well. So, I don't know, it might be interesting to look at how, you know, if one going up sort of coincides with the other going down, or whether if one group is seen as more legitimate in using violence, the other is as well. But I mean, I don't know, did you look at anything like that in your studies?
Very, very interesting question. No, we didn't. We only looked at police legitimacy in general, and that has a mediating effect. As usual, that model is very, very strong. So when people perceive that there's fair procedures, they tend to legitimize authorities. And when they legitimize authorities, in this case, it's related to lower support for protester violence, and stronger support for police violence. So we did ask people whether they justified police violence. I don't know if that would help. So we asked the same question. So do you think that it's justified when police officers use violence to control a demonstration, or hit a demonstrator when they have apprehended him, or increasing the level of strength? I don't know. And usually this is the relationship with justification of protester violence is perfectly inversed. So the more you support protester violence, the less you support police violence. But what I find very interesting, and which is something that I've always wanted to research, is why do people legitimize the police tend to also support police violence. So is it because they think that violence is warranted because the situation is very dangerous? Or is it because they just trust the police and think that they should be supported? Or it's like there are different hypotheses of why police legitimacy should have an effect on different. You could think the same with protester violence. So maybe if you read this, might be like a methods issue. So maybe you read a description of a situation where violence is used in a demonstration, but if you support demonstrators, then maybe you read into the statement as being less violent than other people who perceive it as more violent. So that could also be like a methods problem with how sentences are framed and how specific or general they are.
I mean, first of all, thank you. That's really interesting. I was wondering if you'd find that kind of inverse relationship. Also, I mean, to the second point, I think there's some research that found that people see protesters as less violent when they agree with them politically. So if I'm like left-wing, I see left-wing protesters as using less violence than if I'm right-wing, for example. So, I mean, also fitting with people legitimizing police violence, it might just be like supporting political violence against people you don't like and for people that you do like. I think that would be my instinct of why people might make that difference, or at least it would fit with that research, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that would lead to a different hypothesis. So instead of just saying that if you experience violence, therefore you support more violence, it would mean that when you read the items, you're thinking of more violent demonstrations. So, for example, if it makes sense. So if you experience violence, then you're thinking about this whole situation as very high in violence instead of whether you did not experience violence. So again, I think that there's, as in different studies or different research, it depends on how you ask the questions, and you can be very specific and explain a situation using a vignette. So for example, this happened, this person went here, and this happened exactly. Or you can have more general statements. And when you have more general statements, people can fill in the gaps of information. And then the way they do might be different depending on your ideology or depending on your previous experience. Yeah, definitely.
And actually also what is construed as violence or not, right? So, and that relates to like the chapter Patricio Saavedra, you know who yes, thank you. And John Drury have in our book, they also talk about these different conceptions of violence that are shaped by culture and the political context and previous experiences. And so, for example, in the US, you know, everything related to property destruction, right? Whether or not property destruction, for example, is construed as violence is a question. So I'm wondering, in your items, actually, how you asked, whether it was more general, the way you just said it, just asking about violence without specifying, or did you talk about like attacking police or property
destruction? There were some examples, like attacking police officers, destroying property on the streets, blocking or using like barricades on the streets, so on and so forth. But there were specific examples.
Okay,
and they were
but
like
it included both.
High continuum.
But it also included property and barricades, which, you know, not everyone might see barricades as violent, right? For example.
Yes, definitely. But they do load in the same item with throwing stones at the police, and we all agree that that's basically violent.
Yeah. But my point is just it might be interesting if you follow up with this to look at some of the, you know, the differences between violence that actually attacks a body versus violence that attacks property or something that might even be seen as protection, like a barricade, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, I think that that's more for qualitative research.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions from people that are not Leah or myself? We've been having a nice triad. What about Diego? You have your camera on and look very attentive. Do you have questions or comments?
Yeah, I was very attentive, but I don't know if the question I have is already answered. because I wanted to discuss about the emotions that were implied in this process. And I think that the perceiving procedural injustice is not just a rational process, of course. And I was wondering if it was possible to include anger and fear in these models, because I think I have the idea that those emotions were measured in the different weights of the questionnaire.
Yes, exactly. We measured fear and anger. I mean, anger is always related to procedural injustice. That's something that we know already. Fear, I don't know. I haven't looked into fear, but you would expect the more you experience police violence, you should be more afraid. But then the more afraid you are, it should lead to less support for protester violence. But as Johanna was saying, it can be that it's not actually there because people don't really care about being harmed. They are more angry about the situation, and it's basically then we would find that it has no effect. But that's an empirical question. So we should look into emotions. Yeah, the problem with this model is that it's already like cross-lag panel, random intercept cross-lag panel models are very complicated to estimate. So if you have like too many variables, it makes it very difficult. But yeah, we could do some other analysis.
I guess, Monica, what I also always like to bring in is if you have any questions for us, is there anything that would be helpful for you I don't know if you've already written this up, or is there anything that's on your mind that would be helpful to get some feedback on?
No, I think I'm just surprised of the findings, because I think that it's interesting how in all the qualitative research, identification with radical protesters appears as something like really, really relevant. And it's really weird that it doesn't show up here as being a result of having experienced police violence. So I'm not really sure why you would find this in qualitative research and not in this quantitative study.
It could be as simple, I mean, that's not uncommon, right? That qualitative and quantitative findings show divergent patterns as opposed to convergent patterns. And I think in part it's simply because in qualitative work, the voices of a few individuals, right, will carry weight, whereas in quantitative work, they become outliers or standard deviations. So it might just be that for some, it's really important and it spoke really, like you don't know, I don't know how that data is reported in the qualitative studies, whether they report if this was like a pervasive finding, or if it was just a few people, right, who formed this kind of powerful theme that was maybe well supported with powerful quotes, but not necessarily like an average phenomenon across the board, right? So that's one simple statistical explanation. Or it could have to do with specific interview questions, how they were asked, right? If the researchers approach it through that lens and with that interest and really dive into identity, maybe that also shapes the responses a bit differently, or they sampled maybe looking for participants with certain experiences. Many methodological explanations, I think.
Yeah, those are really good points. I think they did find like very generalized effects, but at the same time, they did in the UK with the crowds research, they did measure like violent measures that were not so violent. So, for example, like they did the study with people trying to avoid a tree being cut down, and then they would, instead of, they wouldn't leave, or they would like, yeah, sometimes throw stuff at the police, but most of it was being more reactive than actually violent. So maybe it's more likely that you'll find these reactions when the violence is not so strong. and in our study, we did have some more extreme types of violence.
Or also, I mean, did you check if there was a ceiling effect of identification already? Maybe they were already highly identified to begin with, and there wasn't much room to move.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, because the sample is very varied. We do have people who have low identification, who are very contrary to demonstrations in general. So I wouldn't think that that's the explanation, but I do think that the other options, they do make a lot of sense.
Okay, so we are now exactly at 1 hour. So if there are no further questions right now, then we'll end this session. And you know how to contact Monica if you have questions later. So thank you so much, Monica, for sharing your work with us. It's a really important topic, and I think increasingly more as police repression to protest is increasing across the board globally, everywhere, right? So it's important work.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you for joining, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.